She slapped the black scholarship student so hard the entire cafeteria fell silent. The tray hit the tile first, spinning once before it clattered flat. Then came the soup, a wide arc of broth and vegetables that splashed across a pressed white uniform blouse and dripped, slow and obscene, onto polished floors that had never known a stain. 300 students froze mid-bite. Chopsticks hovered. Conversations died in the middle of sentences. And in that suspended, breathless second, phones rose into the air all across the room, dozens of them, held high and steady, hungry for the moment. Yuna Beek did not look afraid of what she had just done. She looked satisfied, the way people look when they have finally said the thing they have been holding in their mouths for weeks. Her hand was still raised, fingers loose, as if the slap had cost her nothing at all. She tossed her hair back and surveyed the cafeteria like a queen surveying a kingdom that owed her its silence. "Maybe now you'll remember your place," she said, loud enough for the cameras to catch every word. "Scholarship girls don't get to look at me like that. You're lucky this school even let you in." The girl she had struck did not cry out. She did not stumble, though the blow had been hard enough to turn her head. She stood very still, one hand braced lightly on the edge of the table, and let a slow, quiet moment pass before she lifted her fingers to the corner of her mouth, where a thin line of blood had begun to well. She studied her own fingertips for a moment, almost clinically, the way a scientist studies a sample. Then she looked up. Her name was Zuri Han, though almost no one in that cafeteria had ever bothered to learn it properly. To them, she was simply the African girl, or the scholarship student, or, on the cruelest days, nothing at all, a presence to be looked through rather than at. She had grown up across 2 continents, in red dust and skyscraper shadow, fluent in 4 languages and silent in most of them by choice. She did not raise her voice. She did not raise her hand. She simply looked into Yuna Beek's eyes with an expression that contained no fear and no hatred, only a terrible, patient clarity, as though she were memorizing something for later. Then, without another word, she turned, picked her bag up off the floor, and walked out of the cafeteria while 300 phones followed her exit. In the corridor outside, away from the cameras, she finally stopped. She did not cry there either. She took her phone from her pocket, scrolled to a single contact saved only as a string of numbers and a small green leaf icon, and pressed call. It rang twice. "It's me," she said quietly, in a language none of her classmates would have recognized as anything but music. "I'm ready now, you can come." She ended the call before the voice on the other end could finish exhaling in surprise, and she walked to her next class as if nothing at all had happened. What none of the 300 students filming in that cafeteria understood, what none of their parents and none of their teachers and none of the reporters who would descend on the university within hours could possibly have known, was that this single, soft-spoken phone call would unravel a political dynasty before the next sunrise, expose a decade of buried corruption, and place the city's most celebrated young prosecutor, a man who did not yet know the girl's name. Directly between the family he had been born into and a woman he was about to fall in love with. Zuri Han had spent 3 years at the country's most prestigious university being underestimated, and she had let every single person underestimate her, because the lie had always served a purpose. She was, by the modest paper trail the university kept on her, an international business student from a humanitarian aid background, raised primarily across small towns and refugee corridors in West Africa by a Korean-American couple who had devoted their lives to medical relief work. That part was true. What the registrar's office did not know, what her professors did not know, what even her two closest friends on campus did not know, was that she had been formally and legally adopted at the age of 19 by one of the most powerful men in the country, Chairman Cootho, founder and head of Seoyang Holdings, a conglomerate with its fingerprints on half the redevelopment contracts, shipping lanes, and hospital systems in the nation. Only a small circle of attorneys, the chairman himself, and Zuri carried that knowledge, sealed behind non-disclosure agreements thick enough to choke a courtroom. She had asked for the secrecy herself. When the chairman, a man who had buried a wife and a son and had nothing left to leave behind but the company that had cost him both, had first proposed adopting her after meeting her at a relief gala where she'd quietly corrected 3 of his executives on a misallocated aid budget, she had only one condition. She did not want to be handed anything. She wanted to walk through a single, ordinary door in her life without a fortune unlocking it first. The chairman, who understood pride because he had built an empire out of his own, had agreed on one further condition of his own, that the moment she called and said she was ready, he would come, and he would not ask her to explain. She had never made that call, not when classmates excluded her from their study groups. Not when professors assumed her accent meant her English needed remediation. Never mind that she also held a working command of Korean, French, and 2 regional African languages, more than any of them could claim. Not when landlords, assistants looked at her identification a beat too long before processing her paperwork. She had absorbed all of it in silence, filing it away the way she filed away every insult, every slight, every small daily cruelty, because she had decided long ago that her dignity was not something anyone else could take from her unless she allowed it. There had been other moments before the cafeteria, smaller ones that never made it onto anyone's phone screen. A professor who had, on the first day of a seminar, asked her to confirm she understood the reading level required for the course, in front of 30 classmates, despite her transcript sitting open on his desk, showing a perfect academic record. A group project, sophomore year, in which her 3 Korean teammates had quietly reassigned her portion of the work to someone else without telling her, then submitted the assignment under all 4 names anyway, assuming, correctly as it turned out, that she would rather absorb the unfairness than make a scene about credit. She had absorbed that one too, and simply made sure, for every project afterward, to keep records precise enough that no one could ever do it to her again without consequence. None of it had broken her. All of it had taught her exactly how much patience the world expected from people who looked like her, and exactly how little patience it offered in return. But there were limits, and Yuna Beek's open palm across her face in front of a packed cafeteria, accompanied by the words scholarship girls don't get to look at me like that, had found the very last one. Yuna Beek had never had to learn what limits were. She had grown up in a house where doors opened before she finished reaching for them, where teachers rounded up her grades before report cards were even printed, where the word no had simply never been spoken to her with any consequence attached. Her father, Mayor Beek, had run the city for nearly a decade, and in that decade he had built not merely an administration but an atmosphere, the unmistakable sense, threaded through every school board, every zoning office, every police precinct, that the Beek family's comfort was simply part of the natural order of things. Yuna had absorbed that atmosphere the way other children absorb a native language. She did not think of herself as cruel. She thought of herself as correct. The world had told her, in 1,000 small confirming gestures, that wealth and worth were the same words spoken in two different tones, and she had never once been forced to consider that the world might have been wrong. She had taken a particular interest, over her 3 years at the university, in students who arrived on scholarship, and an even more particular interest in the rare ones who weren't Korean. There was a private satisfaction in watching them try to make themselves smaller, try to disappear into hallway corners, try to be grateful enough, quiet enough, invisible enough to be left alone. Zuri had never once tried to make herself smaller. She walked through the same halls Yuna walked through with the same unhurried, unapologetic posture, met every gaze without flinching, and never once offered the small flinch of deference that Yuna had come, without realizing it, to require from people she considered beneath her. That refusal, more than anything else, was what Yuna could not forgive. It was not insolence she punished in the cafeteria that afternoon. It was a kind of equality she had never agreed to grant. A few corridors away, in an office stacked floor to ceiling with case files, the mayor's eldest son sat reviewing financial documents that had nothing, on the surface, to do with any of it. Mayor Beek had built a reputation, in the 5 years since passing the bar at the top of his class, as the most relentlessly honest prosecutor in the district attorney's office, a reputation that had cost him a great deal at his father's dinner table. He was cold in the way disciplined people are sometimes mistaken for cold, measured, careful, allergic to performance, with a stillness in his face that made witnesses tell him the truth, simply because they could not imagine lying convincingly to someone who looked at them so steadily. He believed, with an almost religious intensity, that the law existed to be the one thing in society that did not bend for money, and it was precisely that belief that had driven an ever-widening wedge between himself and his father. For 18 months, Minhan had been quietly building a file on a pattern of land reassessments around the city's eastern redevelopment corridor. Parcels rezoned at suspiciously convenient moments, appraisals that moved in directions that made no economic sense unless someone with inside knowledge was buying ahead of the announcements. Every thread he pulled led, eventually, back toward City Hall. He had not yet found definitive proof connecting his own father to it. He was beginning to suspect that some part of him did not want to. He rarely visited the mayoral residence anymore. Holidays had become brief, awkward transactions, his mother's worried eyes moving between her husband and her son like someone watching 2 trains on a collision course from a great distance, unable to do anything but watch. He had never met the scholarship student his younger sister liked to complain about at family dinners. The girl, Yuna called her, always with a faint curl of her lip, as if the absence of a name were itself a kind of insult she enjoyed delivering. Minhan had paid it no attention. He had no idea, on the afternoon his sister's hand connected with a stranger's face in a university cafeteria, that his own carefully separated worlds, family loyalty and professional integrity, inherited privilege and earned conviction, were about to be forced into the same room, and that a woman he had never met was about to become the fault line running straight through the middle of his life. The video reached the internet within 11 minutes of the slap, and could not be killed after that no matter how many calls the mayor's office made. University administrators, summoned by a single furious phone call from City Hall, scrambled to scrub it from campus social channels. But the internet does not forget on command, and by evening it had already migrated far beyond anything a university press office could reach. Witnesses who had filmed clear footage of the incident received quiet, almost gentle calls from numbers they didn't recognize, suggesting it might be wiser, for the sake of their scholarships, their housing assignments, their futures, to simply forget what they had seen. Most of them deleted their footage. A few did not, and simply uploaded it from accounts that could never be traced back to them. Zuri refused when campus security finally located her that evening and asked with visible discomfort whether she intended to file a formal complaint, to press any charges at all. She thanked the officer for asking and said, with a calm that unsettled him more than tears would have, that she did not need the university's help. She returned to her dormitory, washed the dried blood from the corner of her mouth, and the next morning walked into her 9 o'clock lecture exactly on time, sat in her usual seat, and took notes as though the entire cafeteria had not watched her get struck across the face the day before. It was, in its own quiet way, more devastating to Yuna Beek than any lawsuit could have been. Yuna had wanted tears. She had wanted to see the girl's composure finally crack, had wanted some visible proof that the slap had landed somewhere it mattered. Instead, she got silence, and a steadiness that read, to anyone watching closely, less like submission and more like patience. The particular patience of someone who is no longer trying to win an argument because she has already decided how the story ends. Far from campus, in the top-floor office of a glass tower that overlooked half the skyline Mayor Beek's administration had spent a decade reshaping, an old man in a gray cardigan watched the cafeteria footage on a tablet held very still in one hand. He did not raise his voice. He did not even change his expression very much. Chairman Cootho had buried a son many years before the granddaughter who now bore his name had ever come into his life, and in the years since, he had learned to keep his face perfectly composed over almost anything. He watched the footage twice, slowly, the way he reviewed contracts before signing them, and when it ended the second time, he set the tablet down on his desk with great care, as though it might shatter. "Prepare the aircraft," he said quietly to the assistant standing near the door, and something in his voice made the assistant, who had worked for him for 11 years and had never once heard him raise it, leave the room without asking a single question. Minhan Beek encountered the cafeteria video almost by accident, 3 days later, while cross-referencing unrelated witness statements on his office computer, and finding a clip auto-playing in the margin of a news aggregator he kept open for unrelated reasons. He watched it once, then a second time, leaning forward with the particular stillness that overtook him whenever something in front of him didn't add up. It was not the slap itself that snagged his attention, ugly as it was. It was the girl. The way she had not flinched away after the blow landed. The way she had looked, for one unmistakable second before she turned to leave, less like a victim and more like someone privately confirming a hypothesis. He began making quiet inquiries the way he made all his inquiries, without authority, without a warrant, simply with the patient, methodical persistence that had built his reputation. Students he interviewed in the cafeteria that week gave him careful, rehearsed non-answers, eyes sliding toward the door, voices dropping when his sister's name came up. Fear, he had learned long ago, has a particular texture, and the entire student body of that cafeteria seemed coated in it. Only one woman, a cafeteria worker named Mrs. Choi, who had spent 11 years ladling soup onto trays and watching 3 generations of students pass through her line, was willing to speak to him plainly, on the condition that her name never appear in any official document. She didn't fight back because she wanted to, Mrs. Choi told him, wiping down a counter that did not need wiping, mostly so her hands would have something to do. She wanted everyone to see exactly what happened, with no excuse for anybody to look away afterward. That girl doesn't lose her temper. She waits. I've watched her 3 years. She's the most patient person I've ever served lunch to, and I've served lunch to a great many patient people. Minjun thanked her and left with more questions than he had arrived with, and a small, unfamiliar feeling settling somewhere beneath his ribs that he did not yet have a name for, though it would not take him long to find one. In the days between the cafeteria worker's quiet testimony and his first real conversation with the girl at the center of it all, Minjun found himself doing something he rarely allowed in his work: watching rather than acting. He requested, through channels careful enough that no one in his father's office would notice the request had been made, the university's public event archive, recordings of debate tournaments, guest lectures, a model United Nations conference held the previous winter. In each one, he found the same young woman seated near the back, rarely raising her hand, but when she did speak, the room tended to go quiet in a way it hadn't for anyone else. In the model UN footage, representing a delegation no other student had wanted, she had dismantled, calmly and without raising her voice once, an opposing argument about humanitarian aid distribution that had taken the room nearly 20 minutes to recover from. He watched that single clip 4 times before he closed his laptop, told himself it was professional due diligence, and knew, even as he told himself that it wasn't entirely true. His sister, meanwhile, had begun to notice things she did not have the vocabulary yet to name. The video's circulation had not died down the way scandals usually did at the university. Usually a fresh embarrassment arrived within a week or 2 to bury the last one, but this time the silence afterward felt different, heavier, populated by glances she could not quite read. Professors who had once laughed easily at her jokes in office hours now answered her questions with careful, clipped politeness. A sorority sister who had been her closest friend since freshman orientation began finding reasons to be busy. Yuna told herself it would pass. The way everything in her life had always eventually passed, smoothed over by her father's name and her family's comfortable proximity to every institution that mattered. She did not yet understand that the smoothing required someone with the power to do the smoothing, and that the only person with that kind of power on this particular campus had just publicly claimed the girl she'd struck as his own blood. He met Zuri Han in person 8 days after the slap, in a quiet corner of the university library, where she had taken to studying once her usual table had become a minor tourist attraction for students hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl from the video. He introduced himself plainly, without rank, without his father's name attached, and asked if she would be willing to answer a few questions about the incident, for an investigation that had, by then, quietly widened far beyond a single cafeteria slap. She studied him for a long moment before answering, the same unhurried, evaluating look she had given Yuna Beek the day blood touched the corner of her mouth, though there was nothing hostile in it now, only a careful kind of attention. "You're investigating fairly," she said finally, not as a question. Most people in your position wouldn't bother. Most people in my position aren't required to bother, he said. I do it anyway. A faint, almost imperceptible warmth crossed her face, gone before it could properly be called a smile. They spoke for nearly an hour, longer than either of them had intended, the conversation drifting well past the incident itself into questions of jurisdiction and justice, of how systems quietly protect the people who already hold power and quietly punish the people who don't. She spoke in clean, unhesitating English that shifted, without apparent effort, into flawless Korean whenever a precise legal term required it, and once, briefly, into French, when she wanted to make a point about colonial land law that the English language seemed to flatten. He found himself, against every habit of professional restraint he had spent 5 years cultivating, listening more than he was asking. He noticed, with the same exacting attention he brought to a case file, the particular quality of her intelligence, not performative, not eager to be admired, but simply present, the way a well-built bridge is simply present, holding weight without announcing that it is doing so. She noticed, in turn, the particular quality of his integrity, the way he asked questions he clearly already half suspected the uncomfortable answers to, and asked them anyway. Neither of them said anything about what was beginning to happen in the quiet space between them. Neither of them needed to. The attraction settled into the room the way certain kinds of weather settle into a valley, gradually, and then completely. The cars arrived on campus 4 days after that conversation, 3 black sedans and a long matte gray vehicle that students would later describe, with varying degrees of awe, as looking like something out of a film about people far too rich to attend their own university. The university president, alerted by a panicked phone call from the front gate, met the procession personally, sweating through his suit jacket before the first car door had even opened. Lawyers stepped out first, followed by 2 members of Seoyang Holdings board, followed finally by Chairman Cootho himself, moving slowly but with absolute purpose across the courtyard, ignoring the university president's stammered greeting entirely. His eyes fixed on a single figure standing near the library steps with a stack of books pressed against her chest, and an expression of dawning, helpless disbelief. He walked directly to her, and in front of several hundred students who had abandoned their afternoon classes entirely to watch whatever this was, he embraced her, the gesture neither stiff nor ceremonial, but unmistakably, achingly familial, the embrace of a man who had waited 3 years for permission to claim her publicly, and had finally, at long last, received it. "My granddaughter," he said, loud enough that there could be no mistaking it, loud enough that it traveled across the courtyard in the particular hush that falls over a crowd in the instant before it erupts into noise. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 full seconds before it shattered into a wave of gasps and whispered names being repeated to students who had not heard correctly the first time. Somewhere near the edge of the crowd, Yuna Beek, who had come outside to see what the commotion was about, felt the blood drain entirely from her face and had to grip a railing to keep from sitting down on the courtyard steps in front of everyone. The chairman addressed the crowd briefly, his voice carrying the particular calm authority of a man who had spent 4 decades in boardrooms learning exactly how much information to release, and when. He explained, simply, that his granddaughter had chosen, against his own preference and entirely of her own will, to attend this university and live among its students without the protection or the burden of her family's name, because she wanted whatever she earned here to belong to her alone. He thanked the university for its education, noted, in a tone that made several administrators visibly pale, that Seoyang Holdings was currently reconsidering the scope and timeline of several billion-won investments tied to ongoing redevelopment partnerships with the city government, and said that he would be very interested, in the coming days, to understand precisely what had occurred in the cafeteria the week before. Not everyone inside Seoyang Holdings welcomed the chairman's sudden, public reordering of priorities. 2 days after the courtyard announcement, a senior board member named Director Lim, who had spent a decade quietly positioning himself as the chairman's eventual successor, called an emergency session to question whether redirecting investment scrutiny toward a sitting mayor's administration, a relationship Seoyang had profited from for years, was sound business judgment, or simply an old man's sentimentality finally catching up with him. "With respect, Chairman," Director Lim said, in the careful tone of a man who did not actually mean the respect he was offering, "we have shareholders who care about returns, not redemption arcs. This girl has been part of this family for 3 years? And already she's costing us relationships we built over decades." The chairman let the silence stretch long enough that several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats before he answered. "Those relationships," he said quietly, "were built on contracts that, according to my own auditors, may not survive a basic legal review. I would rather lose a decade of convenient business than spend the next decade explaining to a courtroom why I already knew and said nothing. If that costs us your confidence, Director Lim, I expect you'll find the door requires no key to open from the inside." Director Lim did not raise the question again, though he would, within the year, quietly resign his position and accept a role at a rival conglomerate, taking with him a grudge that never fully dissolved, but no longer any leverage to act on it. With a cold, sinking clarity, exactly what kind of danger his daughter's open hand had invited into his administration. Seoyang Holdings was not merely a business partner of the city. It was, through a tangle of subsidiary contracts that Mayor Beek had been quietly tracing for a year and a half, deeply enmeshed in nearly every major redevelopment deal the mayor's office had pushed through over the past decade, deals that had, not coincidentally, made the mayor and several of his closest allies extraordinarily wealthy along the way. A chairman with motive to look closely was the single worst outcome the mayor could have imagined, and his own daughter had personally delivered that motive into existence with one open-handed strike across a cafeteria. That evening, Minhan Beek found Zuri sitting alone on a bench beneath the library's old camphor trees, still visibly shaken by the afternoon's revelation, the careful composure she wore like armor finally, briefly, set aside. He sat beside her without asking permission, which she noted and did not mind. "You could have told me," he said, not as an accusation, simply as a fact laid carefully on the table between them. "I could have told anyone," she said. "I didn't tell anyone." That was the entire point. She looked at her hands for a moment before continuing. "I wanted, just once in my life, to be looked at the way you looked at me in that library, like a person whose name was worth learning, not a fortune worth flattering. If you had known who I was when we met, I would never have known whether you were curious about me or simply careful around money." He considered that for a long moment, turning it over the way he turned over evidence, looking for the load-bearing truth in it. "I wasn't careful around money in that library," he said finally. I didn't know there was any to be careful around. I was careful around you because you were the first person in this entire investigation who didn't seem to be afraid of anything. It was not a confession of love. Neither of them was ready for that yet, and both of them, in their separate, disciplined ways, were too careful to rush toward a word that large. But something settled between them on that bench beneath the camphor trees that had not been there before, an understanding, fragile and entirely unspoken, that whatever came next, they intended to meet it honestly, and they intended to meet it together. The weeks that followed deepened that understanding one quiet, accumulating gesture at a time. There were no grand declarations. There was, instead, coffee carried 2 cups at a time to a library table where she was working too late. There were long walks along the river that wound past the edge of campus, conversations that drifted from case law to her grandfather's quiet grief over a son he had lost, to her own complicated feelings about a name she had spent 3 years hiding and was now being asked by an entire city to wear publicly. There were evenings when he showed up at her dormitory simply to sit with her in silence while she worked through a difficult passage of reading, offering nothing but his presence, which, she discovered, was very often the only thing she actually needed. He told her, one evening on a bench overlooking the river, about the brother he had nearly become and chosen not to be, the version of himself that could have taken a comfortable seat somewhere inside his father's administration, smoothing over irregularities instead of chasing them, trading conviction for comfort the way so many people around him had. She told him, in turn, about the years before her adoption, about watching humanitarian aid evaporate into corrupt local pockets before it ever reached the people it was meant for, about deciding, at 12 years old, in a clinic that had run out of medicine 3 weeks before the next shipment was due, that she would never again be the kind of person who simply watched systems fail people without doing something about it. Their meetings became frequent enough that Minjun's mother began, with the particular delicacy of a woman who has spent decades reading the moods of powerful men, to ask careful questions at family dinners that he answered as briefly as possible. His father asked no questions at all, which was, in its own way, worse, because Minjun understood exactly what his father's silence meant. The mayor had begun, quietly and methodically, applying every form of pressure he had spent a career learning to apply, calling in favors with the district attorney's office to have the redevelopment case reassigned, suggesting through intermediaries that Minjun's career trajectory might suffer considerably if he continued down this particular road. And finally, when none of that worked, simply calling his son into his study and asking him, man to man, father to son, to let it go. "This family has given you everything," Mayor Beek said, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who genuinely believed himself to be the reasonable one in the conversation. "Your education, your name, every door that opened for you opened because of what I built, and you would tear it down over a few rezoned parcels and a girl you've known for a month." "I'd tear it down," Minjun said quietly, "because it was never yours to build that way in the first place, and because the girl you're talking about answered a slap with more dignity in one afternoon than this family has shown in a decade." His father did not speak to him again for 11 days. There were ordinary evenings, too, the kind that mattered more than either of them admitted at the time. Once, during exam season, she fell asleep mid-sentence at the library table where he'd brought her dinner she hadn't asked for, and rather than wake her, He simply sat across from her for 2 hours grading nothing, reading nothing, doing nothing but guarding the quiet so she could have it. When she woke, embarrassed, apologizing for wasting his evening, he told her it hadn't been wasted at all, that watching her rest, for once, without the weight of being watched by anyone else, had been the most restful thing he'd done in months himself. Another night, after a difficult conversation with her grandfather about the public role she would eventually have to step into, she showed up at his apartment unannounced, something she had never done before, and instead of asking what was wrong, he simply made tea, set it in front of her, and waited, in a silence so unhurried that she found herself talking within minutes, the words arriving easier than they ever had when someone pushed her for them. He learned, over those months, the particular shape of her fears, not fear of her grandfather's enemies, which she met with the same calm she met everything, but the quieter fear that she would someday be loved only for the resources she now openly carried, the very thing she had spent 3 years of careful invisibility trying to outrun. She learned, in turn, the particular shape of his, not fear of his father's anger, which he had long since made peace with, but the quieter fear that the law he believed in so completely might someday fail to protect the people he loved most, the way it had so visibly failed to restrain the very family that had raised him. Neither fear vanished simply because it had finally been spoken aloud. But each of them, in naming it to the other, found it carried a little less weight than it had carried alone. The pressure did not come only from his father directly. It arrived, more often, through the mayor's longtime chief of staff, a sharp, soft-spoken man named Director O, who had spent 15 years making himself indispensable by handling precisely the kinds of problems that could not be handled in daylight. Director O had built his own quiet fortune shadowing the mayor's, his name tucked into 2 of the shell entities Minhan's investigation had already flagged, and he understood, with the particular clarity of a man protecting his own exposure rather than someone else's, that Minhan posed a far greater danger than the mayor himself was willing to admit. He arranged, without the mayor's direct knowledge, for a journalist friendly to City Hall to receive an anonymous tip, suggesting that Minhan's relationship with Zuri Han was no accident at all, that the ambitious young prosecutor had deliberately cultivated a romance with a chaebol heiress to leverage her grandfather's resources against his own father, a calculated betrayal dressed up as love. The story ran 2 days later under a headline designed to wound rather than inform. Minhan read it standing in his own kitchen at 6 a.m, coffee going cold in his hand, and felt something close to panic for the first time in longer than he could remember, not for himself, but for what it might do to a woman who had spent 3 years building a life specifically so that no one could ever again accuse her of using a family name to get what she wanted. He called her immediately. She did not pick up. He found her, hours later, exactly where he expected to, in the same library corner where they had first spoken, her expression carefully blank in a way he had come to recognize as the particular mask she wore when something had actually managed to hurt her. "I should have expected this," she said quietly, not looking up from the book she wasn't really reading. "It's a very old story. Powerful family uses outsider for convenience. Outsider mistakes it for affection. People will believe it because it's easier than believing 2 people from different worlds simply chose each other. Then let them believe whatever requires the least imagination," he said, sitting down across from her, close enough that she had to look at him. "I'm not asking you to trust a newspaper. I'm asking you to trust 8 months of late nights, every conversation we've had on this bench, the fact that I recused myself from the one case that could have made my entire career, specifically so no one could ever accuse me of exactly what they're accusing me of now. If you need proof beyond that, tell me what it looks like, and I'll spend the rest of my life providing it." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he began to wonder if he had said the wrong thing entirely. Then, finally, something in her shoulders loosened, the careful mask slipping just slightly. "I don't need proof," she said. "I needed to say it out loud once so it would stop living quietly in the back of my mind. Thank you for not letting me sit with it alone." Within a week, Director O's fingerprints on the leaked story surfaced as a minor footnote inside the much larger financial trail Seoyang's auditors were already assembling. One more name added to a growing list of people who had spent years profiting from the mayor's proximity to power, and were now, each in turn, discovering exactly how little loyalty that proximity actually bought them when the accounting finally came due. There was a night, not long before the auditor's findings became public, when the danger stopped being abstract. Minhan left his office past midnight and found, when he reached his car, that someone had left an envelope tucked beneath his windshield wiper, containing nothing but a single photograph of himself and Zuri walking along the river 2 weeks earlier, and a folded note with no signature that read only, "Some doors are better left closed for everyone's sake." He did not show it to her immediately. He sat in his car for a long time afterward, engine off, turning the photograph over in his hands, weighing the particular cowardice of protecting her by saying nothing against the particular honesty he had promised her on that library bench. Honesty won, as it generally did with him. He told her everything the following evening, and watched her read the note twice before setting it down with a steadiness that he had, by then, come to expect from her and still found himself quietly amazed by. "They want you frightened," she said. "Don't give them the satisfaction of being right about you." She paused, then added, more softly, "And don't carry this alone next time. Whatever this costs either of us, it costs us together, or it isn't worth carrying at all." He reported the threat through proper channels the next morning, declined the protective detail his own office offered him, and continued the investigation exactly as he had been conducting it before, though he did, after that night, walk Zuri home a little more often than strict necessity required, and neither of them pretended that was only about logistics. That the true shape of the phone call Zuri had made in that corridor finally became clear to everyone watching from the outside. The chairman's forensic auditors, granted full access to a decade of Seoyang's redevelopment contracts at his explicit instruction, had spent the intervening weeks tracing a pattern that, once assembled, could no longer be explained away as coincidence. Land parcels purchased through shell entities days before zoning announcements that should have been confidential appraisal firms that returned suspiciously convenient valuations on properties connected to the mayor's closest political donors. A network of accounts that traced, through 6 careful layers of obfuscation, back to officials inside City Hall, including, in the final and most damning ledger, the mayor's own chief of staff, and 2 transactions further down the chain, the mayor himself. The phone call Zuri had made in that corridor, the one the entire city had spent weeks assuming was an act of revenge, had never been about revenge at all. She had simply told her grandfather, in 4 quiet sentences, that she was ready to stop hiding, ready to let her name carry the weight it had always carried, so that the resources attached to that name could finally be pointed at something worth fixing. The slap had not created the corruption. It had simply removed the last reason she had to keep pretending she didn't have the power to expose it. Seoyang's auditors handed their findings to federal prosecutors within days, and the case landed, through no engineering of Minjun's own, on a desk 2 offices down from his, assigned to a colleague he trusted completely. Bank records surfaced, wire transfers, a pattern of land fraud stretching back 9 years, with bribes disguised as consulting fees and shell companies registered to addresses that turned out to be empty parking lots. Political allies who had stood beside Mayor Beek at 100 ribbon cuttings began, almost overnight, returning campaign contributions and issuing carefully worded statements about the importance of accountability. The particular cowardice of people who have spent years benefiting from a man's power, suddenly discovering principles the moment that power becomes a liability. That night, in a private dining room on the top floor of the Seoyang Tower, Chairman Seo sat across from his granddaughter for the first time as a man whose secret had finally been laid bare to the world, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the relief of it outweighed the danger. He told her, for the first time in any real detail, about the son he had lost, a brilliant, restless young man named Seo Jinwoo who had died in a car accident 11 years earlier. On a stretch of road the chairman had since had quietly rebuilt twice, though the rebuilding had never once made the grief smaller. Jinwoo had wanted, before he died, to do exactly the kind of work his father's company had never prioritized: community accountability, transparency audits, the unglamorous architecture of making sure money meant for ordinary people actually reached them. The chairman had dismissed the idea at the time as naive. He had spent every year since wishing he hadn't. "When I met you at that aid gala, correcting men 3 times your age about a misallocated relief budget," the chairman said, turning a teacup slowly in his weathered hands, "I did not adopt you because I was lonely, though I was. I adopted you because for one evening, watching you argue with people who underestimated you and beat them anyway, I thought I was watching my son again. I have spent 11 years trying not to need that feeling. I am too old now to keep pretending I don't." Zuri reached across the table and covered his hand with her own, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said. It was, she would tell Minjun much later, the first time in her life she had understood that being chosen and being needed could be the very same thing. Rather than 2 separate gifts, she had to earn one after the other. The mayor was arrested before dawn, 6 weeks after a slap in a cafeteria had set the entire collapse in motion. Led out of his own residence in handcuffs past television cameras that had been tipped off just early enough to capture every step of it. Yuna Beek watched the footage from inside the house, still in pajamas, the same phone that had once existed mainly to broadcast her popularity now broadcasting. On every channel, the dismantling of everything she had assumed was permanent. She did not cry, not at first. She simply sat very still on the staircase where she used to pose for photographs, and understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, that the world she had been so certain owed her deference had never actually been built on anything solid at all. It had been built on her father's fear, and other people's fear of her father, and fear, it turned out, evaporates the moment it stops being useful to maintain. In the weeks that followed, Yuna discovered, slowly and without anyone making it easy for her, what it felt like to walk through spaces that no longer rearranged themselves around her arrival. The university, when she finally worked up the courage to return to a half-empty lecture hall, did not expel her, but it did not protect her either, and the particular vertigo of being treated like an ordinary student for the first time in her life left her disoriented in ways she had no language for. She withdrew before the semester ended, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself a great many things that spring that she did not yet believe. It was, oddly, a single brief encounter with Zuri herself that began to shift something in her. They crossed paths by accident near the administration building, both of them retrieving paperwork, and Yuna, expecting contempt or at least a cold satisfaction, found instead that Zuri simply looked at her the way she looked at most things, steadily, without cruelty, without performance. "I'm not going to pretend what you did to me doesn't still hurt," Zuri said quietly, before Yuna could find words of her own. "But I also don't think hating you gets either of us anywhere worth going. What you do next is the only part of this that's actually still yours to decide." Yuna did not know, in that moment, what to say, and so she said nothing at all, but the sentence followed her home, and stayed with her through a long, humbling year in which she returned to campus properly, enrolled, against her own initial instincts, in a community outreach practicum that put her, for the first time in her life, in direct and unmediated contact with the kinds of people her father's administration had spent a decade quietly failing. She was not transformed overnight. People rarely are. But she began, slowly, to ask different questions than the ones she had grown up asking. And the woman she became over the 2 years that followed bore little resemblance to the girl who had once believed an open hand and a sharp word were simply the natural order of things. Minjun formally recused himself from the case the same day his father was charged, citing the obvious conflict of interest, and spent the following weeks in a strange, suspended quiet. No longer a prosecutor pursuing his own family, no longer entirely the son he had been before any of this began, occupying a space he had never had to occupy before, where professional duty and private grief existed in the same body without canceling each other out. He visited his mother often in those weeks. He did not visit his father at all, though he made sure, through quiet arrangements with colleagues he trusted, that due process was followed precisely, scrupulously, without a single shortcut taken in either direction. It was, he told Zuri one evening, the only gift he had left to offer a father who had taught him to believe in justice, and then spent a decade demonstrating exactly how easily that belief could be betrayed. The gift of treating him exactly as fairly as he would treat anyone else, no better and no worse. Minjun's mother, who had spent 30 years learning to read the silences in her own marriage, sought Zuri out quietly during this period, away from both men, over tea in a small shop neither of their families would have thought to look for them in. She did not apologize for her husband, which Zuri respected, and she did not ask Zuri to forgive him either. She simply said, turning her cup slowly between her hands, that she had watched her son disappear a little more each year into the careful, guarded version of himself their household required, and that in the months since Zuri had entered his life, she had started, for the first time in a long while, to recognize her own son's laugh again. "I don't know what happens to this family," she said. "I don't know what's left of it when the dust settles. But whatever happens, I would like you to know that you didn't break anything that wasn't already breaking long before you arrived. You may be the only honest thing that's happened to this family in years." It was not forgiveness, exactly. and it was not quite a blessing either, but it was real, and Zuri carried it with her through everything that followed, a small, steady warmth in the middle of a season that offered very few of them. The city slowly returned to its ordinary rhythms, the way cities do even after their foundations have visibly cracked. A new acting mayor was installed. The redevelopment corridor cases moved, slowly and properly, through the courts. It was spring again, the camphor trees in full leaf, when Minhan found Zuri sitting on the same library bench where they had first sat together in the immediate aftermath of her grandfather's courtyard announcement. There were no lawyers this time, no reporters, no security detail trailing discreetly at a polite distance. Just two people who had spent a year being tested, separately and together, by exactly the kind of pressure that breaks most things, sitting beneath blooming branches with nothing left between them but the truth. "I think I admired your courage before I understood what was underneath it," he said, choosing the words slowly, the way he chose every word that mattered. "Then I respected what was underneath it. And somewhere in the middle of all that, without ever deciding to, I fell in love with the way you answered cruelty with dignity instead of revenge." She studied him for a long moment, the same evaluating look she had given him the very first day in the library, except now there was nothing guarded left in it at all. "I noticed you," she said, "long before you let yourself notice me. I just decided to be patient about it. I've found that patience tends to get rewarded, eventually, if you're willing to wait long enough for people to catch up to what's already true." He laughed, a real laugh, unguarded in a way few people had ever heard from him, and the sound of it settled something in her chest that she had not realized was still waiting to be settled. They did not build what came after on power, or on the particular kind of safety that comes from having more money or more influence than the people around you. They built it deliberately and slowly on the one currency neither of their families had ever fully trusted: plain, unhurried honesty, offered freely and without condition, the kind that does not need a fortune or a title to survive. Zuri eventually stepped, on her own timeline and her own terms, into a quiet leadership role inside Seoyang's philanthropic division, redirecting a portion of the conglomerate's enormous resources toward the kind of community-level accountability work that had shaped her own childhood conviction that systems could be made to serve people instead of quietly failing them. Minhan left the district attorney's office 2 years later to help found an independent anti-corruption unit, one built specifically to investigate cases too politically dangerous for prosecutors still answerable to elected officials. Work that cost him, by his own quiet estimation, considerably more in comfort than it would ever pay him in salary, and that he would not have traded for anything. He proposed to her, eventually, not with cameras or a rented ballroom, but on the same library bench beneath the same camphor trees, on an ordinary Tuesday evening with no occasion attached to it at all, because he had come to understand that she had spent her whole life being offered grand gestures by people who wanted something from her. And what he wanted to offer instead was simply the plainest, smallest, truest moment he could find. She said yes before he had even finished the sentence, laughing at her own eagerness in a way that startled them both. And when she called her grandfather afterward, the old man was quiet on the line for a long moment before saying, in a voice thick with something he rarely let himself show, that her father, whichever father she meant by that, he added, because by then he no longer needed to specify, would have loved watching her become exactly who she was. Their wedding, held the following spring in a modest garden, rather than any of the ballrooms Seoyang could easily have afforded, brought together two families that had spent a year being remade by the same scandal in opposite directions. Minjun's mother attended, finally able to exhale in a marriage of her own that had quietly ended its public performance once her husband's case concluded, choosing, at last, a smaller and more honest life of her own design. Yuna attended too, seated near the back without expecting or receiving any particular attention, and when Zuri crossed the room afterward to thank her for coming, the two women spoke for a while as something that, if not quite friends, was no longer anything close to enemies. Two people who had each, in entirely different ways, learned the same hard lesson about what dignity actually costs and what it's actually worth. The ripples moved further than either of them could fully trace. The anti-corruption unit Minjun helped found took on, within its first 2 years, cases in 3 other cities, each one modeled on the same patient, methodical persistence he had once applied to a single set of suspicious land parcels. Mrs. Choi, the cafeteria worker who had been the only one willing to speak plainly when no one else would, received, quietly and without her name ever attached to it, a scholarship fund in her honor that paid for 2 of her grandchildren's university tuition in full. And on the same campus where it had all begun, a small plaque appeared the following year outside the cafeteria doors, funded anonymously, bearing no names at all, only a single line that every new student walked past without fully understanding, until eventually, some of them did. That the truth does not require a raised voice to be heard, only someone patient enough to make sure it finally is. Years later, when people in the city told the story of that season, the slap, the call, the fall of a dynasty that had mistaken fear for respect, they rarely remembered the precise sequence of charges, or the names of the shell companies, or the exact billions Seoyang had threatened to withdraw. What they remembered, instead, was the image that had outlasted all of it. A young woman standing perfectly still in a cafeteria, blood at the corner of her mouth, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. Sometimes the loudest people believe power comes from fear, but true power belongs to those who never need to raise their voice. One slap had humiliated an innocent woman before hundreds of witnesses. One quiet phone call had exposed decades of corruption. And in the ruins of a fallen political empire, 2 people found something neither wealth nor influence could ever buy, a love built on truth. And a city, slowly, painstakingly, learning to build itself on the same foundation. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who loves unforgettable love stories. And if you're passionate about powerful Afro-Korean romances filled with emotion, culture, and unexpected twists, hit the subscribe button and become part of our family. Click the next video on your screen and let another incredible journey begin. I'll see you there.